June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. The steel ramp of the landing craft Vehicle Personnel (LCVP) crashed down into the churning surf, instantly transforming the relative safety of the hull into a deadly funnel. For the men of Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, the view was a vision of hell. German machine gun fire, pre-sighted on the landing lane, ripped through the opening. The sound a sickening metallic tear that mixed with the screams of the first soldiers to fall. The water ahead was a frothing maelstrom of obstacles, artillery geysers, and tracer fire. In that single paralyzing moment, the entire outcome of the D-Day invasion, and perhaps the war in Europe, hinged on the design of a single, unglamorous vessel. What the German defenders, secure in their concrete fortifications, did not realize was that they were facing a machine born not in a traditional naval yard, but in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, perfected by the irascible genius and sheer force of will of a man named Andrew Jackson Higgins. The mathematics of amphibious warfare were about to be rewritten not by admirals, but by a boat builder who had defied the United States Navy at every turn. The strategic problem facing the Allies in 1942 was as vast as the oceans themselves. To defeat the Axis powers, they would have to project massive military force across seas and onto hostile shores. This was not a new concept. The disastrous Gallipoli campaign of World War I served as a grim reminder of its perils. But modern warfare had added terrifying new dimensions: tanks, trucks, and the need for rapid reinforcement under heavy fire. The United States Marine Corps, studying the prospect of a war in the Pacific, understood this dilemma more acutely than anyone. To dislodge the Japanese from their island empire, they would need to launch an unprecedented series of amphibious assaults against heavily defended coral atolls and jungle coastlines. The existing tools for this job were pathetic. The U.S. Navy's standard landing craft was a large, cumbersome vessel that had to be carried by ship and lowered into the water. It required a deep draft, making it useless in shallow waters. Even worse was the Navy's own tank lighter, which was little more than a scow that had to be pushed ashore by a tugboat. It was slow, vulnerable, and completely impractical for an opposed landing. The Marines had a clear, brutal set of requirements for the perfect landing craft. It had to be fast, to minimize time under enemy fire. It had to be shallow draft, to run right up onto the beach. It had to be highly maneuverable. It needed a protected propeller to operate in shallow, debris-filled water. Most critically, it needed a strong, forward-mounted ramp that could be quickly lowered to disgorge a full platoon of 36 combat-ready soldiers, or a jeep and 12 men, directly onto the sand, allowing them to exit as a fighting unit rather than wading through chest-deep water under murderous fire. No such craft existed in the official naval inventory. The entire Allied grand strategy, the liberation of Europe, and the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific was, in 1942, a theoretical fantasy bottlenecked by a simple yet unsolved problem of naval engineering. The solution was not found in the hollowed halls of Annapolis or the drafting rooms of the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair. It was found 1,100 miles inland in the bustling, chaotic shipyard of Higgins Industries on the Industrial Canal in New Orleans. The man at its helm was Andrew Jackson Higgins, a figure who seemed to have been conjured from a Mark Twain novel. He was a profane, hard-drinking, perpetually furious Irishman with a genius for practical mechanics and a contempt for bureaucracy that knew no bounds. Higgins was not a naval architect by training. He was a self-taught lumberman and boat builder. He had moved to New Orleans and built a business supplying the lumber industry with shallow draft vessels capable of navigating the treacherous, log-choked swamps and marshes of the Louisiana bayous. To succeed in this environment, he had developed a unique expertise. His boats were tough, fast, and could operate in just inches of water. They were designed to run full speed onto a muddy bank, unload their cargo of lumbermen or equipment, and then reverse power to pull themselves back into the channel. The core principles of the perfect landing craft, shallow draft, bow ramp, and protected propeller, were already being used every day by Higgins workboats, most notably the Eureka boat. The Eureka was a masterpiece of pragmatic design. It featured a shallow V hull forward that smoothed the ride in choppy water, flattening aft to allow for maximum stability and a minimal draft. Its most revolutionary feature was a hollow tunnel stern that protected the propeller and rudder from grounding and underwater obstacles. Higgins was a relentless perfectionist and a fierce competitor. He once raced one of his own boats against a Navy vessel in a contest for a contract, not only winning, but deliberately throwing up a huge wake that drenched the admiring Navy officials on the competing boat. He was exactly the kind of unorthodox, problem-solving maverick the situation demanded. The Marine Corps, desperate for a solution, found Higgins. In 1938, they expressed interest in his Eureka boat for use as a landing craft. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, however, was a fortress of tradition and resistance. Their engineers were skeptical of this outsider, this boat builder from New Orleans with his radical ideas. They preferred their own deep draft designs and were deeply suspicious of the tunnel stern and the shallow draft hull, which they believed would perform poorly in the open ocean. What followed was a years-long battle of wills. Higgins would later famously state, "My three toughest opponents during the war were the Japs, the Nazis, and the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships, though not necessarily in that order." The Bureau threw up endless obstacles, bureaucratic red tape, unrealistic specifications, and outright rejection of his proposals. They insisted on a spoon-shaped bow, which Higgins knew was inferior for beaching. They demanded a tractor model where the craft was pushed ashore. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the Empire of Japan. In the late 1930s, a Marine Corps officer showed Higgins a blurred photograph of a Japanese landing craft that featured a bow ramp. It was a revelation. Higgins immediately saw its superiority. He combined this concept with his proven Eureka hull. He designed a new craft with a squared-off bow that incorporated a massive power-operated ramp. When closed, the ramp formed a sleek, pointed bow that shed water. When open, it became a wide gangway for rapid deployment. He called this new hybrid design the landing craft, Vehicle Personnel, LCVP, the Higgins Boat. The Navy remained unconvinced. It took the direct intervention of senior Marine Corps leaders and the looming specter of a global war to force a proper trial. In a series of dramatic head-to-head tests in 1941, the Higgins boat was pitted against the Navy's best design. The results were not even close. The Navy's craft wallowed in the waves and struggled in shallow water. The Higgins boat, with its tunnel stern and revolutionary hull, raced to the beach, slammed ashore, dropped its ramp, and reversed off the sand with ease. The Navy's objections were silenced by irrefutable performance. Reluctantly, and under immense pressure, the Bureau of Ships granted Higgins the contract. America finally had its landing craft. The LCVP was a masterpiece of brutalist functionality. It was 36 feet long, 10 feet wide, and built not for elegance, but for survival. Its construction was a testament to Higgins' understanding of mass production and durability. The hull, made of thick, laminated oak planks, it was strong enough to withstand beaching on coral reefs and rocky shores. The shallow draft, semi-V design allowed it to plane at speeds up to 12 knots, making it the fastest landing craft of the war. The power plant, it was powered by a single 225 horsepower gray marine diesel engine, or later a 250 HP Kermath engine, chosen for its reliability. The engine was mounted high in the hull, connected to the propeller via a long drive shaft that ran through the protective tunnel stern. The tunnel stern. This was Higgins' signature innovation. By enclosing the propeller and rudder in a recessed tunnel, he allowed the boat to operate in water as shallow as 18 inches without fouling or damaging its propulsion system. This single feature made beach landings possible. The bow ramp, a 14-foot wide steel-tipped ramp operated by a simple winch and cable system. It was heavy enough to crush beach obstacles and could be lowered in seconds. The ramp was the entire raison d'etre of the craft, transforming it from a transport into an assault spearhead. Armor and armament. It was not a warship. Its armor was light, designed to stop small arms fire and shrapnel, but not direct hits from heavy weapons. It was typically armed with 2.30 caliber machine guns mounted on the stern quarters to provide suppressive fire during the approach. But the boat was only half the story. The other half was Andrew Higgins, the industrialist. He transformed his New Orleans yard into a powerhouse of production, embracing principles that would later be called just-in-time manufacturing. He broke down the construction process into simple, repeatable steps. He hired and trained a workforce that was unprecedented for its time, including women, African Americans, and the elderly, paying them equal wages for equal work long before it was common. The men who crewed the Higgins boats were not typically Navy sailors. They were coxswains, enlisted men trained specifically for the perilous job of amphibious assault. Their training was as brutal as the craft they operated. They practiced endless beach approaches in all weather, learning to read surf, navigate through complex obstacle fields, and master the delicate art of hitting the beach at the precise moment and angle. The coxswain was the heart of the operation. Standing at the helm, at the stern, exposed from the waist up behind a small shield, he was the pilot, navigator, and commander. His job required nerves of steel. On the approach, he had to steer a straight course amidst a storm of incoming artillery and machine gun fire. His only protection, the thin wooden hull of his boat. He had to judge the surf and the beach gradient perfectly, hitting the sand hard enough to secure a landing, but not so hard as to stove in the bow. At the moment of landing, he had to hold the boat steady against the surging waves while his human cargo disembarked into the maelstrom. Then, he had to reverse power and extract the boat, often while it was taking fire and taking on water from damage sustained on the beach. These men and their unarmored wooden boats were collectively known as the Splinter Fleet. The name was grimly literal. A direct hit from an artillery shell would turn the boat into a cloud of deadly wooden splinters. Their life expectancy during a hot landing was measured in minutes. They had one of the most dangerous jobs of the entire war, and their success depended entirely on the robustness and reliability of the machine Andrew Higgins had built for them. The Higgins boat was the workhorse of every major Allied amphibious operation of World War II. Its impact was immediate and transformative. Operation Torch, North Africa, November 1942, the first major test. While hampered by inexperience and poor planning, the Higgins boats proved they could successfully deliver thousands of troops onto a hostile shore, validating the entire concept of large-scale amphibious invasion. The Pacific Theater. This was where the Higgins boat truly came into its own. At Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the story was the same. The Marines lived and died by the Higgins boat. At Tarawa, where tidal miscalculations left boats stranded on a distant reef, the disaster would have been absolute without the few LCVPs that could traverse the shallow lagoon. They became the lifeline, ferrying wounded back to the ships and reinforcements forward under relentless fire. Operation Overlord, D-Day, June 6, 1944. This was the Higgins boat's ultimate proving ground. Of the 1,500 vessels that participated in the initial assault, over 1,000 were Higgins boats and their larger LCM counterparts. At Omaha Beach, where the German defenses were strongest, the LCVPs faced their sternest test. They disgorged the first waves of infantry directly into the killing zone. The image of the ramp dropping to reveal a hail of German fire is the enduring icon of D-Day. Despite catastrophic losses in the first wave, the boats kept coming, wave after wave, for hours. They were the indispensable conveyor belt that fed the battle, eventually delivering over 100,000 men onto the beaches of France in a single day. Without the Higgins boat's ability to shuttle men and material from ship to shore with relentless efficiency, the Normandy landings would have been impossible. The Higgins boat's role did not end on the beaches of Normandy or the islands of the Pacific. It became the indispensable workhorse for every subsequent river crossing and amphibious operation in the European theater. During Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, a combination of high winds and inexperience led to a tragic scattering of the airborne forces. Many paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne drowned when their planes, flying too low, dropped them into the ocean. In the chaotic aftermath, it was the Higgins boats patrolling the shoreline that plucked hundreds of these paratroopers from the water, saving them from drowning and turning a potential disaster into a salvageable operation. This unplanned role as a rescue vessel highlighted its versatility beyond its designed purpose. Later, as the Allied armies pushed towards Germany, they were confronted by a series of formidable river barriers: the Seine, the Moselle, and most dauntingly, the Rhine. The German High Command believed the Rhine, wide and swift-flowing, was a natural defensive barrier that would halt the Allied advance for months. They destroyed all permanent bridges and fortified the far banks. To cross it, the Allies would need to mount the largest river assault since Napoleon's time. Once again, the solution was the Higgins boat. In Operation Plunder in March 1945, a vast armada of LCVPs and their larger LCM, landing craft mechanized siblings, were trucked across the European countryside to the Rhine's edge. Under cover of a massive smokescreen and artillery barrage, these craft ferried the first assault waves of British and American troops across the river, achieving complete tactical surprise. The Germans, who had anticipated a long, brutal battle of attrition at the Rhine crossings, were stunned by the speed and volume of the assault. The Higgins boat, designed for ocean beaches, had now carried the war into the very heart of Germany. The statistics are staggering. Higgins Industries produced 23,398 vessels for the Allied war effort. Of the 93,000 ships in the U.S. fleet during World War II, over 20,000 were Higgins-built. By the end of the war, an astounding 92% of the entire U.S. Navy consisted of ships built by Higgins Industries. But the numbers alone don't capture the full impact. The strategic legacy is profound. The Higgins boat made the Allied grand strategy a reality. It was the key that unlocked the Second Front in Europe and the tool that systematically dismantled the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. It enabled the Allies to choose the time and place of attack, forcing the Axis to defend thousands of miles of coastline. The ultimate tribute came from the highest authority. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower was asked after the war for his opinion on who was the most important figure in the Allied victory. He did not name a general or an admiral. He named a boat builder. Andrew Higgins, Eisenhower said, is the man who won the war for us. When asked to elaborate, he explained, he designed the landing craft that made the invasions possible. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. Even Adolf Hitler recognized the threat, referring to Higgins in his wartime monologues as the new Noah. Despite his monumental contribution, Andrew Higgins' post-war story was one of struggle. The government canceled its contracts abruptly, leaving him with massive overhead and no orders. He fought a long, futile battle for compensation. Higgins Industries, the arsenal that had built the tools of victory, was largely dismantled by 1946. Andrew Higgins died in 1952, his health broken by the immense strain of the war effort and the subsequent legal battles. He was a man who had given everything to his country, only to be cast aside in peace. Today, The legacy of the Higgins boat is etched into the very fabric of modern military doctrine. Its design DNA is visible in every amphibious assault craft in the U.S. inventory. The AAVs, amphibious assault vehicles, and the next generation ship-to-shore connectors are the direct descendants of Higgins' vision. The fundamental principles he established, the bow ramp, the protected propeller, the shallow draft hull, remain the global standard for amphibious operations. The Higgins boat stands as a timeless testament to the power of American ingenuity, industrial might, and the unyielding spirit of one man who refused to take no for an answer. It was not a glamorous weapon. It carried no big guns. It won no dogfights. It was a simple, tough, unassuming wooden boat. But it carried the hope of freedom across every hostile shore, from the coral atolls of the Pacific to the bloody sands of Normandy. It was, in the most literal sense, the vessel of liberation, the boat that delivered democracy onto the doorstep of tyranny, and in doing so, truly earned the title bestowed upon it by history. The boat that won the war.